Tonight, a story about salt. About camels, and sand, and about men who could find their way across an enormous desert with almost nothing to guide them. It is a true story, and a slow one. You do not need to follow it closely. You do not need to remember any of the names or the dates. If you drift off somewhere in the middle, that is exactly what this is for. So let your shoulders soften. Let the blankets settle around you. I will keep my voice low, and the story will simply carry on, the way a caravan carries on. One step, then another. The Sahara is not one desert. It is many. There are seas of dunes, and there are flat gravel plains that go on for days without a single rise. There are places where the ground is pale and cracked, and places where it is dark and hard, and places where it is nothing but soft yellow sand that moves under your feet like water. Across all of it, for well over 1,000 years, people walked. They walked because the desert had something the South wanted, and the South had something the desert wanted, and between them lay about a month of empty ground. What the desert had was salt. Not a sprinkle of it. Great slabs, cut from the earth like paving stones, white and grey and streaked with brown. And what the South had was gold, and grain, and cloth, and above all people willing to trade for salt. So the caravans crossed. They crossed in autumn and winter, when the heat was bearable, and they came back in spring. They did this year after year, generation after generation, and the route stayed roughly the same because the wells stayed roughly the same. Everything about the salt trade came down to that one fact. You could go anywhere in the desert. But you could only survive in a few places. And the road ran between them. The salt came out of the ground at places with very few people and no reason to exist. The best known of them today is Taudeni, in the north of what is now Mali. There is no town there in any ordinary sense. There is a dry lake bed, and under the lake bed there are layers of salt, laid down long ago when there was water here, and a climate that no longer exists. The miners dug down through a crust of clay and rock. Below it they found the salt in sheets. They cut it with simple hand tools into slabs, roughly the size of a door panel, and thinner than you might expect. Each slab weighed somewhere in the region of 30 kilograms. The work was done in pits, out in the open, with the sun overhead. The men who did it lived in shelters made from broken salt and stone, ate food that had been carried in from hundreds of miles away, and drank water that had been carried in as well. Almost nothing at Taudeni grows. Almost nothing at Taudeni lives. The whole settlement existed because of what lay under the floor. And when the caravan arrived, the slabs that had been cut and stacked over weeks were counted, tied, and lifted onto the camels. Then the desert took them away. Here is a detail I find lovely. In the 14th century, a traveler named Ibn Battuta came through a salt mine further north, a place called Tagaza, which did the same job before Taudeni took over. He wrote about what he saw, and one thing in particular stayed with him. The houses, he said, were built of salt. The walls were slabs of salt. The roofs were covered with camel skins. There was no other building material for a very long way in any direction, so people used what was under their feet. He was not impressed. He called it a village with nothing good about it. He noted that flies were troublesome and the water was brackish. He was clearly glad to leave. But the picture has stayed in people's minds for 700 years, because it is such a strange and simple image. A little settlement of white houses in the middle of nowhere, made entirely of the thing everyone had come for. Rain would have dissolved them. But rain, in that part of the Sahara, almost never comes. So the salt houses stood. They stood for as long as anybody wanted the salt, and then, when the trade shifted south to better deposits, they were left alone, and the desert quietly took the site back. Now, the camels. A loaded camel on the salt road usually carried 4 slabs. 2 hung on each side, roped so they lay flat against the animal's flanks, like the covers of a very large book. The weight had to be even. If one side was heavier than the other, the load would work loose over the course of a day, and then it would have to be stopped for and fixed, and stopping a whole caravan to fix one camel is the sort of thing that wears everyone down. So the loading was done slowly and carefully by men who had done it 1,000 times. They knew the sound a properly tied load makes. They knew the way a slab shifts when the rope is a little slack. Camels are well suited to this and not, in truth, especially fond of it. They complain when they are made to kneel. They complain when they are made to stand. But they can go for many days without water, they can eat thorn scrub that would kill most animals, and their broad feet spread on soft sand instead of sinking. Nothing else available at the time could have done the job. The caravan moved at the camel's pace, which is a slow walking pace, and everybody in it walked or rode at that same steady speed, hour after hour, all day. In the Sahelian languages of the region, a salt caravan is called an azalai. The word covers both the journey and the great assembly of animals that makes it. In the busiest centuries, an azalai could be very large indeed. Contemporary accounts describe thousands of camels moving together, though numbers in old records are often generous, and it is fair to be careful with them. What is certain is that a caravan was not a handful of travelers. It was closer to a moving town. There were merchants who owned the salt, and drivers who handled the camels, and a guide who was paid well and separately, because he was the reason anybody arrived. There were water skins and grain sacks and cooking pots. There were spare ropes and spare camels. The whole thing set off from Timbuktu in the cooler months, walked north for around 2 or 3 weeks to the mines, waited while the salt was loaded, and turned around. 2 to 3 weeks back. 6 weeks or more away from home, and then, when the year came round again, they would do it once more. Some men made that journey every winter of their working lives. They knew the route the way you know the walk from your bedroom to your kitchen in the dark. The day had a shape to it, and the shape rarely changed. They started early, in the cold blue part of the morning before the sun was properly up, because those hours are the kindest ones. They walked. Around the middle of the day, if the season demanded it, they stopped, and the camels were made to kneel, and people rested in whatever shade could be arranged, which usually meant a cloth stretched over sticks. Then they walked again into the evening. When they camped, the loads came off, the camels were hobbled so they could graze on whatever they could find without wandering far, and a fire was lit if there was anything to burn. There was tea. There was often not very much else. Bread cooked in the ashes of the fire. Dried meat. Dates. And then a long night under a sky with no light pollution at all, which is a sky most of us have never actually seen. The stars in the deep desert are not scattered dots. They are a thick, crowded field, bright enough to cast a faint shadow. That sky was not just a beautiful thing to lie under. It was the map. And a good guide had spent his whole life learning to read it. Navigation in the Sahara worked without instruments. No compass, in the old caravans. No charts. What the guides had was memory, and the sky. They knew the pole star, which sits almost still while everything else wheels around it, and which in that latitude hangs fairly low above the northern horizon. Holding a course meant keeping that star at a particular angle over your shoulder for hour after hour. They knew the great bright stars that rise at particular points on the horizon at particular times of year, and they used those risings the way a sailor uses a bearing. Some accounts describe guides sleeping with their heads pointed in the direction of travel, so that on waking they already knew which way to face. What made this work was not one clever trick but the sheer depth of the knowledge. A guide had usually made the journey with his father, and his father with his. The route existed as a long chain of remembered things, a rise here, a scatter of dark stones there, a place where the ground rings hollow underfoot, a dune that has kept roughly the same shape within living memory. The stars gave direction. The remembered landmarks confirmed it. Together, they were enough. And there was the ground itself. This is the part that sounds like legend, and it is not entirely legend, though it has certainly been polished by retelling. Travelers and colonial officials wrote repeatedly that experienced guides could tell where they were from the sand. They would take a handful, feel its coarseness, look at its color, sometimes taste it, and say how far they had come and what lay ahead. Some of these accounts are second-hand and some are clearly embroidered, so I would not want to promise you the more dramatic versions. But the underlying idea is sound, and modern geologists would recognize it. Sand is not uniform. It varies in grain size, in color, in mineral content, in how much salt and clay it holds. Those variations follow the geology underneath, which changes slowly and consistently across the desert. A man who has crossed the same 300 miles 40 times, paying close attention, would come to know those changes the way a gardener knows the soil in different corners of a garden. It is not magic. It is simply an enormous amount of ordinary attention, gathered over a lifetime, in a place where attention is the difference between arriving and not arriving. The wells were everything. A well in the deep Sahara might be a hole 30 or 40 meters deep, cut through rock, with a rope worn into grooves at the lip by centuries of buckets. Around it there would be nothing at all. No village. No trees. Just the well, and the scuffed ground where thousands of camels have stood and waited. Watering a large caravan took a long time. The animals drank enormous quantities, and it had to be lifted, bucket, by hand. So a well was also a place where people met. Caravans going north met caravans coming south. News was exchanged. Prices in Timbuktu were discussed. Someone's brother was asked after. Then everyone went their separate ways again into the emptiness. The wells were maintained by common consent, because everyone needed them and nobody could hold them. If a well fell in, the route had to change, and changing the route meant relearning a piece of the map. This is why the salt roads stayed so stable for so long. They were not roads in the sense of anything built. They were simply the only lines you could draw between the places where there was water. Timbuktu, when it finally came into view, was a low town of mud brick the color of the ground it stood on. The caravan came in tired and dusty and the slabs were unloaded and stacked, and the counting and the arguing over price began. That salt went on, by river boat down the Niger, into places that had no salt of their own, where people needed it to keep food through the wet season and to keep themselves alive in the heat. You may have heard that salt was traded weight for weight with gold. That is almost certainly an exaggeration, repeated because it makes such a satisfying sentence. The truth is less tidy and more interesting. Salt was valuable because it was heavy, essential, and grew nowhere near the people who needed it, and the price shifted with the season and the year, as prices do. Small caravans still make the run to Taudeni today, though lorries do most of the work now, and there is less need for a man who can read the sand. But somewhere out there, tonight, there is a stack of white slabs sitting quietly in the dark, waiting to be lifted onto an animal in the morning. So we will leave them there. The fire has gone down to embers. The camels are folded up on the sand with their loads beside them, and the whole sky has come out, thick with stars, the way it has every night over that desert for as long as anyone has walked across it. In a few hours someone will stand up, look north, find the star he is looking for, and begin walking. But not yet. For now it is simply quiet, and cool, and there is nothing at all that needs doing. Sleep well. Sleepy history, true stories, told slowly.